Thank you, Madam Toastmaster. Good evening, fellow Toastmasters and welcome guests. How many of you have been in a situation before? You're at work and somebody new starts. So you decide to be friendly and you go up to them and you strike a conversation and you're polite and you give them a lot of eye contact. But then you quickly realize that they're doing this kind of stuff, looking around everywhere except your eyes. And then you start to think, is it because I'm annoying or uninteresting? Are they distracted? And then you start to feel confused. Why is this happening? You don't understand. Raise your hand if you've been in that situation before. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you raise your hand, you are more than likely a looker who was talking with a listener. Tonight I want to teach you about the three different types of people: lookers, listeners, and feelers, and why it's so important to understand the way they think so we can avoid these types of miscommunications and misunderstandings. We'll start off with the first one. The most common one, 6 out of 10 people are lookers. Lookers communicate and learn with their eyes. To a looker, appearances matter, so they're usually really well dressed and well groomed, and a looker will make a lot of eye contact with people because they think the way that they think is that a lot of eye contact helps them describe and learn what somebody else is feeling. For example, if they look at somebody and then they notice that their face is grimacing, they might think that that person's in pain. If they look at somebody and their eyes are kind of glazed over, they might think that that person's in thought or distracted. Same thing, if somebody's just looking around, they might think that that person is distracted as well. But the point is that a looker picks up these cues differently than when somebody else might describe as. Which brings me to the second type of person. A listener. 3 out of 10 people are listeners. I myself am a listener. Listeners don't really care too much about eye contact. For them, they're more in tune with what's being said and the audio and are actively listening to words and context clues. To a listener, if you give them a lot of eye contact, it might actually be uncomfortable. For example, let's say you're talking to a looker, for example, and this person just keeps staring at you, and you're wondering, why is this guy looking at me? You glance back and you're like, oh, that's awkward. You don't understand why they're looking at you so much. That's what listeners do. The good thing about listeners is that they're very keen on picking up context clues. They can distinguish vocal tonality. They can understand how somebody's feeling by the way they deliver a message or they say something. They're also very good at recalling and storing conversations. You'd be surprised when you talk to a listener and then 2-3 weeks later, they can tell you what you guys were talking about 3 weeks ago. And that's one of the good things about being a listener. Since I'm an engineer, most of the time I look away, and my boss is a hard looker, so sometimes he gets the wrong impression that I'm just kind of diddly-dallying or being distracted. But that's just not the case. And that leads me to the third and final type of common person. 1 in 10 people are feelers. We were all born as feelers. It makes sense, right? We learned that a puppy is nice and fluffy by petting it. We learned that if we touch a hot stove with our finger, it burns. Most of us were feelers as kids. And as adults, feelers communicate with touch, with motion, with feelings. And when you're communicating with another feeler, you might embrace somebody that you missed for a long time with a warm hug. You might pat them on the back when you feel proud of them. You might shake them, not shake them, but shake their hand in admiration. Feelers really communicate with their body language and with their hands effectively. So when a feeler talks to somebody else, sometimes these touching episodes or whatever you want to call them sometimes come as unwarranted. I think it's one of those things in Western society. Most of us are listeners or lookers, so we're not used to the feelings of touch. For example, if somebody comes up and holds your hand if you feel like you're anxious, or if you're sad, they might wrap their hands around you just to kind of console you. But these are the 3 different types of people: the lookers, the listeners, and the feelers. And I've seen this so many times at work. One of my coworkers is a very smart guy, but he's a completely listener type. And like I said, my boss is a looker type. And every once in a while when we have our development meetings, you can tell that there's so much miscommunication and so much frustration because they don't look eye to eye. They don't understand how the other person thinks. And that's why I wanted to talk about this. If we can just understand that these other types of people think differently, we can avoid these situations. Just because you're a listener talking with a feeler and they run up to you and give you a big warm hug, you don't have to seize up. Just because you're a looker talking with a listener and that listener is just looking around, it doesn't mean that they're distracted. And just because you're a feeler and you go out and shake somebody's hand and they give you a weird look, it doesn't mean that they don't want to communicate with you. It's just the way that other people think. We need to take that into account. And the whole reason for this, like I mentioned with the example with my boss, and as some of you raise your hand when you communicate with somebody who has a different thinking style than you do, it's important to understand how they think so we can avoid the problems that we see, the anxiety, the frustration. It's funny, but there's literally a lot of problems that we can solve within our own family and friends just by understanding how somebody else thinks. Just because they might be, from an outside perspective, they might seem cold and callous. Maybe they're just thinking differently than we are. They express themselves in different ways. And so I want to challenge you guys. Do you think you know what kind of person you are? And if you do, raise your hand. If you're a looker, raise your hand. Wrong way, but I'll take that. If you're a listener, raise your hand. If you're a feeler, raise your hand. If you don't know, raise your hand. Well, the good thing is that most people have different types of attributes as well. They can be a nice blend of one or the other, but some people are definitely a lot more dominant or one or the other as well. And so I implore you guys, or challenge you guys, without harumping me, to go home, talk with your friends and family, maybe coworkers, and see what kind of person that they are, so then you can change your communication style with them and have deeper, more meaningful interactions with them. Thank you. Madam Toastmaster.